This is Janusz. Before we start the interview, I would just like to say that I managed to found in the charity that supports the Hazara in these difficult times. They have been going through various many troubles, as many Mongols are familiar with, ranging from mass killings to just terrible neglect by the Afghan government in general. And I just decided to put this charity out there so that we can get the word out and hopefully get some help to the poor Hazara people of Afghanistan. The link will be in the show notes, and please just go there, and if you have money, just donate and make sure that the Hazara survive as much as they can. Thank you, and have a good day.
Hello, and welcome to the Mongols podcast. I'm your host, Samai J. Morgenstern. And on this episode of the Mongols podcast, we are welcoming a new guest onto the show, a journalist by the name of Bayara.
Hey everyone, my name is Bayara and I live in Ulaanbaatar, the capital city of Mongolia. Degree in journalism and master's degree in sports management, which I obtained in Russia. And recently I started my YouTube channel covering topics about Mongol people living around the world and tradition, culture, and the customs of Mongol nation.
That's awesome. And the big reason why I wanted to bring Bayara onto the show, because I think he does a very good job of covering Mongolia in the present. And while it is very awesome to cover Mongolia's past, as I do, we must eventually use that past to understand Mongolia's present. And I think it would be much better to have a much closer person on the ground for that sort of thing. So I was looking for that sort of future coverage, but then I ran into one of your posts on Facebook, and I was like, maybe we should talk sometime. And as some would say, the rest is history. And now we're going to begin with the interview real quick. So, as for the first question of our interview, what inspired you to cover Mongolia in your journalism?
So I used to work for Mongolian National Broadcasting, which is equivalent of Japan's NHK and China's CCTV and Great Britain's BBC. It's a state-funded television. And while I was working there, I noticed that the mainstream media is heavily censored and very biased, and it has a certain agenda setting. Start my own channel so that uh, regular, everyday, ordinary people can have express their opinion without, the bias and censorship. So my mission and my goal is to give this ordinary Mongolians a voice to the world, and so that I can promote my country, my culture, my tradition to the people living around the world, give the accurate the idea of people living in Mongolia. When people think of Mongolia, they just buildings, tall buildings, and modern technology, but we are actually everything that other countries have, but we are very mixed with tradition and the modern aspect. So I wanted to give the accurate information, accurate image of our country to the world.
That's awesome. And I think that's extremely fascinating because if you ever look at the way I've gone into the internet, I tend to try to find as much independent coverage as possible because the U.S. media is notoriously unreliable on many, many things. And so it's always best to try to find whoever you like and maybe do a bit of fact checking at the very least. But I think judging from what I've seen on your content, and I've been going through it for the past couple of days, and I think I can trust you, and I can trust you a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
So that brings into my second question. What topics do you typically discuss in an average day at work or in the field?
So currently I'm not working for television because I left them about a year ago and started my own project, which is this YouTube channel called Real Mongolia. I also do other freelance jobs such as translating, but this year I just set my goal to cover the various aspects of our Mongolian people. So typically, my goal is to. So I've been trying to interview Mongol people living around the world in the last few weeks. So I posted like a post on Facebook that I'm looking for Hazara people who are interested in interviewing, and also Kalmyk and also Kalmyk people and Buryat people and Tuva people in Russia. So I've been trying to interview a lot Mongol people living around the world, so that I can get a good opinion of Mongol people about our nation.
That's obviously a very fascinating sort of way to get into the arena, as I would say. And what really fascinates me about that is that in many ways it kind of makes me relate to my own experience a bit as a Hungarian because there, but obviously on a much smaller scale because the Mongols have been probably in a sort of unplanned diaspora ever since Genghis Khan began his conquests, and that often makes you think in a way because the Hungarian diaspora was definitely a response to some form of imperialist aggression, and in our case it was the Soviet Union. And obviously that led to a lot of different sorts of stories all over the world because we are suddenly out of the homeland and we are we are suddenly put into a new culture, and sometimes that often is an incentive to get us to assimilate. I can definitely see this amongst some of my own fellow Hungarians. Most Hungarians, at least in my Akron area, are not very fluent in the language if at all, and very few have experienced the culture. Although if you actually get a little closer to Cleveland, that's a totally different story entirely.
Uh-huh. So I met the ambassador, uh, Hungarian ambassador to Mongolia, and she speaks fluent Mongolian, and I was very impressed. And she was speaking better Mongolian than any other foreign person I've ever met. And so, and after that meeting, we talked about our history and our similar aspects, our culture, and since then, my interest in Hungarian culture increased, and from what I read, the Hungarian people are also very good at the horse, and archery is very similar to our culture because Hungarian plants it's similar to Mongolian plants, and because of that, we have a similar culture, horse culture, and this warrior nation. So my interest in Hungarian culture increased after meeting uh, the minister.
Yeah, I can get that because like one of the things that I encountered very early on about steppe culture was actually the person I like to call the man, the myth, the legend, Kashai Lajos. He's actually Hungarian. He lives on the plains, basically as close as a Nősmagyar as you can get.
Yeah.
And he teaches mounted archery, as far as I know, very well. I think he was even involved in a couple of movie consultings. And I actually got introduced to his work when John Mann was actually visiting Hungary for his biography on Attila the Hun. And that's always been a spotlight in my heart because it's like we haven't been interacting with steppe culture for hundreds of years, and now in a way we're having in some ways at least a little bit of a revival, if you will.
So if if you come to Mongolia and ask a random person about Attila the Hun, most of them will say that he is a Mongolian. So we consider him as our part of our history, and I think there is a strong connection between Hungarians and Mongolians in terms of history and culture.
Yeah, that sounds really awesome, and that kind of it brings a little bit into our next question. So Mongolia has been affected by the pandemic, like many other nations. How do you think the country has been affected by COVID-19, and what do you think of the Ulaanbaatar's government's response to it?
Yeah, we've been affected as much as other countries because of the lockdowns and also the border closures. Our economy has been badly hit, especially small and the middle enterprises. They were the hit the hardest, and many small and medium businesses are shut their door. So, because we are bordered by two big countries, Russia and China, and we depend on a huge impact on our economy and also people's standard of living. In terms of the total cases, we have 1,300 cases and 19 deaths, which sounds small compared to other countries, but if you consider our population, which is only 3 million, this number is not that small. And especially this last March has been a very difficult because the total number of cases has been increased almost 50% in the last March. And actually, starting from tomorrow, we're going to be under lockdown for 2 weeks, and people have been rush buying things. Like there's been chaos all day today, and there's a lot of traffic. And this is the fourth lockdown since last November. Because until last November, we had no local transmitted cases, only like a case from abroad, coming from people coming from abroad. And but in November 11th, our first community transmitted case was discovered, and then everything like went to chaos. And um, also, there's vaccinations have started because we are close to China and Russia. Sputnik and the Russian vaccine and the Chinese vaccine, I forgot the name, Sinopharm, is widely available, and people have started receiving their vaccines. But I'm not yet because I wanted to wait for a little bit. So yeah, the economy is badly hit, and tourism, especially tourism sector, is badly hit. And also, I feel bad for the school children because since last February, they have been studying via distant learning methods, and I just feel bad for the school children. Yeah. That sums up. Yeah.
Yeah, I can totally get that because the school children have been having their own measured difficulties over in the US, and we keep on desperately trying to get them back into school, unfortunately, before we even know it's safe. I guess it's just a symptom of America that we tend to wean off our young and wean off our old, and then we just let the rich have more fun in some ways.
Yeah. Also, the tourism industry is very important for our economy because our economy is heavily dependent on like agriculture, and the agriculture and nomadic pastoralism, and tourism is very important. So less tourism is very bad for economy.
Yeah, that can be definitely very difficult. Yeah, and actually, your discussion of like Mongolia being influenced by its neighbors, it kind of brings very much into our next question. Much of Mongolia's foreign policy is based on it being bordered by China and Russia. How does the country deal with being bordered by these two nations?
Yeah, it's a long history. historically, every every part of our history is like a conflict between these two nations. For example, when Soviet Union emerged, we become the Soviet satellite state in 1921, and for about 70 years until 1990, we were under Soviet communist system, and we were heavily dependent on Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries. And other countries, other relations, foreign relations was like no existent because the Soviet Union was like controlling everything, and every economy, trade, and everything was totally in control of Soviet Union leaders. And after 1990, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, things got changed, and the Chinese influence started to grow, and people started to travel, and they started to bring goods from China and other countries. But we uh, we have only two neighbors. This is all. This is the most biggest reason why we are still underdeveloped, and so we are a landlocked country. So everything happens, we have to like depend on China or Russia, and people's opinion have been divided whether we have to rely on Russia or whether we have to rely on China. And of course, historically, we have been have a very like a bad relationship with China because of our history. So people's attitude towards China is kind of negative, general attitude. So the Russian influence, because of the Russian 80-year Russian influence, people tend to like rely on most people opinion is positive towards Russia, and especially since our new president is very close with Russia and Putin. So it's very complicated, but it's kind of it's kind of shifting in the last 20 years since the collapse of Soviet Union. So the Chinese influence is growing and growing in the last 20 years. Yeah.
Well, I've always found it very interesting that in many ways China does its best to, in many ways, become a juggernaut of history, but in ways that don't necessarily go to full on imperialist expansion, but it's much more of an application of what I think would be called a soft power, if you will. Like it manages to leverage its culture, its trading connections, the fertile resources that are often associated with the place, and that really leads to a lot of influences in different places. And I think what really fascinates me coming from your perspective is that you have to, in many ways, figure out a way to balance between Moscow and Beijing, like try to figure out like how to work with Putin sometimes, and maybe Putin doesn't have the best day in the world, which often happens. And on the other end, you have to figure out how things are going with Xi Jinping and his administration. And I find that very interesting because in the mainstream media on my end, we are often lied to about them so many times. Like I remember, like I don't know how many times I've probably heard from the mainstream media about Alexei Navalny being poisoned. And honestly, considering what I know about him, it's kind of disconcerting the things that people on my side of the ocean actually believe.
Yeah. So if you have only two neighbors, you have to keep good relationship with both of them, right? So, but in historical terms, throughout our history, we've been under the influence of like Chinese dynasties, and then like Russian empires. So it's been very like it's been like a power. We're like between these two big nations who tries to grow their influence. So it's like a power play, like a game. It's like a big, great game.
A great game. Oh my goodness. It kind of makes me think of all the times that Russia and Britain tried to spend not conquering Afghanistan a couple hundred years ago. Am I right?
Yeah, So what I so unless these two nations decided to go with war each other, we are safe. But in terms of like a soft power, the lobbying and everything, it's a constant struggle, constant like a political agenda and everything. So it's very complicated.
I can see that, which kind of brings me into the next big branch of Chinese influence, the Belt and Road Initiative, which I like to describe often as a more purposeful development of a sort of Silk Road and China's version of the Marshall Plan. And it is very likely to have a major impact on Eurasia. How do you think it will affect Mongolia?
As for the Belt and Road Initiative, I don't really know much about it. It's been on the media last few years, but things have been like stopped since the COVID, and there's like pipeline or something like that. So I don't really know much about it. Maybe we could skip it.
I see, I see. And with a decent amount of the serious questions out of the way, I thought we'd get into something a bit more enjoyable on your end. Of all the stories that you have covered in Mongolia, what is the one that you have had the most enjoyment covering?
Yeah, when I was working at MNB World, I was actually a sports journalist. So most of the sports videos on my channel is actually from that time. And for sport is my passion. I've been following sports since like young, since I was in high school. And but my one of my also biggest passion is to learn about Mongol people around the world and also the history of World War One, World War Two, and also how the Mongolia is played part in it. Because uh, we helped Soviet Union with materials during the World War Two, and also we fought against Imperial Japan in Halfingol. And so my passion is about mostly about history of the Mongol people, especially since like at the start of 20th century. The last 100 years was like everything turned upside down. The great empires turned into states, and everything changed. So I have a passion for history and culture of people. What I enjoy the most is I think interviewing Mongol people. For example, like I interviewed Hazara people, and also I'm planning to interview all the other Mongol people. For example, in Inner Mongolia, there's a Mongol people. Also in Russia, there's a Tuva and Buryat and Kalmyk people, and also even in Xinjiang, China, there's a um, Mongol-related people. So I enjoy like interviewing all these Mongol-related people, and so I can hear this. I can get their impression of our history and what they're thinking about pan-Mongolic movements, the solidarity of all Mongol people, something like that. So I want to do more videos about this solidarity of Mongol people. I'm kind of a patriotic person, that kind of thing.
I can get that. And I think in many ways the Mongols have every right to be patriotic about their nation. They are in many ways the beginning of how the world is in some ways, because we started much of the modern world with being interconnected by various trade routes, and many of these trade routes were opened up and protected by the Mongols. Admittedly, how the Mongols got into control of these trade routes was not necessarily on the nice side, but the thing is, trade routes are a very valuable thing and quite possibly more powerful than any army. And I think, well, you don't come across those very easily. And so obviously that means that when you get into any sort of way to control them, you not only have to do a lot to keep them on control, but in many ways they will do a lot to create some form of wealth for your country. And obviously that has led to a lot of us being connected with the world. And I think in many ways we have your people to thank for how the world is, and in a really good way. Not necessarily blaming people for pandemic and stuff, but it's more of we have modern world and trade routes partly because the Mongols decided that maybe we should protect the trade and tax it a little bit.
Yeah, I read a lot about Tea Road and the Silk Road and the connection system and trade system that our ancestors had introduced, and yeah, it's been a big change for our ancestors created a lot of changes, brought a lot of changes into the world's history, and also. Uh, since the 13th century and 14th century, there's like a lot of infighting between the descendants of Genghis Khan, and I'm also very interested in like post Mongol Empire, this fragmentation, and for example, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, and Yuan Dynasty. So the Genghis Khan's four sons inherited the Genghis Khan's empire, and then it became like separate empires, separate khanates. So, and then for example, Golden Horde was ruled by this Khans, and the Russians, now Russians, the Rus were like Moscow was like direct subject of the Mongol Khans, and something like that. So there's a lot of to read, and the impact of our descendants is huge, and it's gonna be like a lot of time to take cover this.
Yeah. And I thought that's very important and fascinating, and that makes you think, like, because one of the things I've been doing is like I've been sort of having a sort of series covering of the various divisions of the Mongol Empire. I've actually spent my last couple of weeks trying to find good research on the Chagathites, and that's been quite the rabbit hole. It's gotten me through looking at some of the descendants of Timur, since they tried to do their best to at least look like de facto rulers of the area, and of course there is the fact that they quite surprisingly outlasted basically every other Mongol Khanate in Rum, which is quite impressive considering the sheer amount of infighting. I think I actually had a research paper on this way back in my undergrad, although that was before I really got into Mongol history on the level that I knew where to find my primary sources. So that I think in many ways I wouldn't mind if I had to do that research paper over.
Yeah. So after the Genghis Khan died, his four sons inherited four separate khanates, and there's a lot of stuff happened after that, and from 13th century until like 19th century. But most of the people don't know about it. They just know that Genghis Khan great empire, and then after fragmentation. Actually, I'm kind of impressed by the fact that you mentioned the Mandokaya queen, because most of the people outside Mongolia don't know about her, but there are a lot of actually queens and female warriors in Mongolian history who has played a large role in Mongolian history, and so I just wish that more people recognize female warriors. And there's Ano Khatan, Ano Queen, uh, who is a wife of the Kaltumbash. It was happened in the 15th century, and there's a lot of like Mongolia was at the time. Mongolia was divided between West Mongol and Eastern Mongol. So there's infighting between Western and Eastern, and then the Chinese side empire took advantage of that and just assimilated two empires using that infighting. So that kind of stuff is very interesting to me.
Yeah, I can get that. And also, your discussion of women warriors kind of brings a smile to my face, not only because I'm familiar with the story of Manduhai, but I believe some people, especially if they look a bit into Marco Polo, are more familiar with the most famous undefeated wrestler of all time in Mongolia, Kutlun, if I recall. and obviously she's got quite the story, as I've discussed on previous episodes of my podcast.
Yeah, there are a lot of historical movies based on our ancestors. For example, we have like three movies about Genghis Khan, but there's also a very famous movie about Mandukhar with three parts. And but recently, historical movies have been made a lot with foreign productions, help, and everything. So I suggest to watch these movies if for someone who is interested in our history. Yeah.
I'll definitely have to think about that. I think I did find some clips of the movie on Manduhai. I actually haven't looked into it yet, but I'm definitely going to have to give a reaction to it since I'm the guy who tries to talk about it online nonstop as much as I can.
Does it have a subtitle? Or,
I think it does. I'm not fully sure that it's. I haven't checked out it in a little while.
okay.
And actually, that the discussion of media does bring us into our next interview question. I noticed that many of your videos cover popular sports and games amongst the Mongols. Obviously, you mentioned that a lot of this came from your time with MNB. And how do you think the sports scene in Mongolia functions, especially with the ongoing pandemic?
Yeah, the sports sector in Mongolia is actually revolved around four Olympic sports. So one is judo and shooting and boxing and free wrestling. So the reason why we call this four top sports because we have Olympic medals in these four sports. So Olympic medals and Olympic games is very huge deal in our country. Is it okay?
Yeah, it's working.
Yeah. So the Olympic Games medals is very huge deal in Mongolia. Actually, uh, for if someone wins Olympic medal, he's entitled he or she is entitled to receive a lifetime allowance for his whole life, and so everybody wants to win Olympic medal here. It's or Olympic medals winners are like superstars here. So because we are very good at boxing, this for sport is very huge popular, and also we have our traditional sports, which is horse racing and archery, and of course wrestling. So we call this three mainly sports, and our traditional festival is actually based on these three sports. So if you come to Mongolia in July, you will experience the Mongol Nagan and the Mongol female sports. As
Uh,
for the current situation, yeah, as for the current situation right now, the sports sector has been also badly hit, especially sports clubs, because they can't, of course, they can't run because of the restrictions. And for example, only 10 people can get together in one place. So obviously, it's gonna affect the sports clubs and sports sector. But for example, because of the upcoming Tokyo Olympics, the Olympic qualification events are taking place, and so the athletes who qualified for the Olympics are allowed by the government to practice without restrictions, and they're allowed to travel abroad to take part in, for example, qualification events. Um, Also, there's a two sports growing very fast in here. One is MMA or mixed martial sports. Uh, this sport is very like suited for us because we are traditionally very warriors. You know, we like to fight. You know, everything. So the MMA is very like a good sport for us, and we've been like increasing. We've been very good at this, and actually in the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship, our Mongolian guy uh, signed a contract. I forgot his name. And also in Asian biggest promotion, one championship, there's one guy who's doing really well. He's gonna fight this 14th. So in 5 days he's gonna fight. So everybody's actually waiting for his fight. And the other sport is actually esports, electronic sports. Uh, I don't know the reason, but we are also very good at esports, and especially Counter Strike Global Offensive and World of Warcraft and other stuff. So these two new sports are gaining like popularity here. Other traditional sports are badly hit, but I hope that in May or July, June, things will get better.
Well, I'll certainly say I hope they get better too. It is kind of sad that the Olympics were postponed, and obviously we Americans get very enthusiastic in our sort of involvement in the Olympics. And although usually when I watch the Olympics, I'm usually rooting for the Hungarian or Chinese athletes out there, and I find it's very interesting that a lot of the sports that Mongolians are good at are, of course, sports that would work very well for times of war, like fencing or archery, wrestling, obviously. And
Yes.
I think the wrestling is especially something I find really truly heartening as a person who's covered Mongolian history, because of course we all have some sort of familiarity with Kutlun, as we have mentioned here before, and I thought that was very a good way to keep your ancestors in your heart and make them very proud of you.
Yeah, it was actually mentioned in the secret history of Mongols that Genghis Khan used wrestling to keep his home. Also, there's a case in the secret history of Mongols that Genghis Khan was uh, killed his political enemy by a wrestling match. So it's been part of our history since every type of wrestling sports, not just judo. For example, like sambo, judo, free wrestling, and karate, and everything. So it has this historical connection with us.
Wow, that certainly and that certainly makes you think. It definitely shows that you guys really know how to do, especially all those various sports associated with martial arts. And I think that it kind of actually brings a little bit into our next question. There are some representations of Mongols slash steppe nomads in popular media. I think you're probably quite familiar with Ghost of Tsushima, or perhaps recently, I think there was a big Disney adaptation of Mulan. How do you think these representations do justice to your people, if they do justice at all?
Yeah, I did a reaction video to Ghost of Tsushima, which is about the Mongol invasion of Japan in the 12th century. And I was actually just happy to see that this kind of beacon is set in the time of set in the time of Mongol Empire. So I was just happy to see a piece of our histories in this big game. As for the game, they portrayed our ancestors, the generals, very well. I was very impressed by the visuals and all these graphics. As for the language, the soldiers and generals talking in Mongolian, it wasn't really like accurate. It was more like an inner Mongolian accent. accent. So I could understand them, but I could tell that it's the guy who voiced the soldiers was not from Mongolia, but from Inner Mongolia. So that's the one thing I noticed. But other than that, it was very good game, very good visuals, graphics. Uh, of course, it's a game, so it's not that 100% like accurate. For example, the main antagonist, the bad guy, is Khotun Khan, the grandson of Chinggis. He's a fictional character, and I was actually happy to see that they portrayed our people, portrayed our general in this very cunning and very resourceful fighter. For example, in the start of the video, the Khotun Khan was like killed his enemy, like pouring oil and setting him on fire without fighting. So he was very like a cunning general. This is very accurate description of our ancestors because Mongols were known for their like unorthodox, very like new, innovative way of fighting. So they just, for example, they use different kinds of tactics and strategies to defeat their enemy, not just one traditional one or two methods. They just adapt as they go, learn as they go. For example, when they first encountered big walls and castles, they just learned and just captured the people from that area and asked them how the previous fights went, and they just learned from the other people, and so it's very adaptable way. I'm just very impressed by this game developers how they portrayed our ancestors, this cunning and resourceful nature. As for the Mulan movie, it's very controversial because um, you know uh, Mulan is actually about Xiongnu, the people precedes the Genghis Khan, before the Genghis Khan, Xiongnu people. So as you know, the main hero Mulan is like killed hundreds and thousands of warriors, like with one shot. So it's kind of a very inaccurate way, because it's not based on history. It's a cartoon, but some people in our country was very pissed, very angry about that fight, that scene, because you know nobody wants to see that our descendants are killed by one girl.
Yeah, I can get that. And obviously Mulan belongs to one of those very amorphous sort of dark ages of sorts in Chinese history, where we're sure that the Chinese people were there, but whether we were sure what was happening to them is another story entirely. And in many ways, I would argue that in many ways we didn't know. And I think within the context of Chinese history, the Mulan sort of actually shows up, at least in the historical sense, sometime after the Three Kingdoms period. So that makes a lot of history even more amorphous, because that's basically just legends and people performing, people described as performing almost superhuman stunts. And that obviously makes the history people look a little quizzically. And I found that your reaction to Ghost of Tsushima very interesting, because one of the things about Mongol history is that, like, it is often depicted that the invasions of Japan were a complete another disaster. In many ways, the Mongols were described as foolish and perhaps underestimated their adversaries. But I think in many ways, it's a sort of different thing. It gets more complicated, obviously, because the Mongols, I think for the second invasion, they actually planned the invasion of Japan out and tried to make the best of a complicated situation that, in many ways, was something that was something that really wasn't an easy one for them. And it is quite interesting that I think in some ways it might be a credit to the Mongols' brilliance that essentially the Japanese were saved big time by a giant storm.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a lot of talk about this game in the Mongolian gaming community, and so their opinion was also similar to mine, and they praised the gameplay and graphics. Also, some people were unimpressed by the fact that the Mongols were speaking English, or and they were not speaking Mongolian. But other than that, I was very impressed by this game. As for the other movies made about Mongolia, I also like the Marco Polo series, uh, and also the series about especially about the Mongol people. And I wish that the Hollywood would make a movie about Great Mongol Empire, especially the Batu-Khan conquest of Europe and Russia, the Russian conquest of Russia, because there's a lot of interesting fights, and there's a lot of very good generals in Mongolian history. So I wish that Western media would focus on these conquests and these military campaigns. Some of them were very clever, and there's a lot of like military tactics and strategies still useful today, and especially, for example, during the Mongol conquest of Russia and the Kievan Rus, uh, there was a lot of like difficulties because of the weather, and the Russian weather is, of course, very difficult for any enemy. I think Germans know that, but the Mongol people overcome that difficulties and actually conquered Russia in winter. So there's a lot of interesting topics to cover for Hollywood. So I wish that they could make a movie about, maybe series about this piece of history.
I think in some ways I would definitely agree with that sort of sentiment because it often feels like there are certain stories in history that are ripe for entertaining an audience, and then it just doesn't make it to the big screen. And I often feel like this is the sort of story that would make audiences just like go in awe, and that obviously really would warm my heart because there we historians are often used to reacting to some not so great movies, as I would say. And I think especially we would be able to actually depict Mongolian history in a much better light than we have had in previous years. Because I think there's actually a very old movie starring John Wayne. I think it's known as like The Great Han or something like that. And and unfortunately, John Wayne is playing Genghis Khan. So as you can notice, it's not very respectful, I think, to Mongolian culture.
Yeah,
And I think like with obviously the more informed perspective of more Mongolians around the world, and obviously with greater technology, I think we can bring stories like that of Genghis Khan or Manduhai or Kutlun to a much bigger audience, and get people to love Mongolian history in the ways that you and I do.
yeah, sure.
Yeah. And that actually makes you think a little bit on our next question. You have spoken on the traditional nomadic herding life that is most commonly associated with your people and have lived it for much of your childhood. How does it function today, and how do you think it's changing?
I grew up in the countryside, so I have a special connection with this kind of lifestyle, the nomadic pastoral lifestyle. And actually, now I think 30% of the population is nomadic herders, and we have almost 50 or 60 million livestock. And uh, actually, the nomadic pastoral lifestyle is our culture because we've been always been like nomadic herders since ancient times. So everything about our culture is connected to this lifestyle, our like clothing, food, cuisine, and literature, arts, and everything is connected to it. So I think that we have to protect this lifestyle because it has this unique aspect that nowhere can be found, especially, for example, in this time, the urbanization is growing and people are more and more people are moving to city and living the settled life. So I think I can say that we are the last, truly last nomadic pastoral herders because in other countries like us, they become urbanized, and so we are like last nomadic nation. So um, from my perspective, the nomadic pastoral lifestyle is very eco-friendly lifestyle because you have to rely on nature to sustain your life. So you have to, for example, uh, if your livestock don't have grass to graze, then your life is ruined. So you have to protect it. It's a necessity. You have to maintain this eco-friendly lifestyle. You have to protect it so that your animals can have enough grass to graze. So it's a very people are talking about eco-friendly lifestyle. You have to save your recycle your waste and everything like that. But if you look at our lifestyle, it's just a pure 100% eco-friendly, and it's a best example of living in harmony with nature. So I just want to protect, promote this kind of lifestyle to younger generation. So I I was born in the early 90s. So my generation is grew up with this traditional lifestyle and then also experience this growth of technology and modern social media. So uh, I want just this young generation, especially people born in the 2000s, to uh, connect with this culture because there's this cultural revolution is going on because, for example, Korean K-pop and Japanese J-pop and American media, Hollywood, and then Chinese media, Russian media, everything is trying to get a hold of our cultural, trying to control, trying to gain the cultural aspect. So, so in this kind of confusing times, we have to hold our ground and just protect this kind of lifestyle. Yeah, that's my stance.
Wow, that's obviously a stance I can definitely quite sympathize with. I think through Kushite, as I mentioned before, we Hungarians have only just started to rediscover the lifestyle that Mongols have preserved for hundreds of years. And obviously, this lifestyle is a very difficult thing to keep as the world is getting more modern and in some ways perhaps getting a bit warmer. And I think that makes often people think like we should leave this style and go to the cities and try to make the best of it there. But also, in many ways, the development of the city, as wonderful as it is, often accelerates the decrease of the nomadic lifestyle. As a as a person who loves history, I want to see that lifestyle go on for as long as it can. So obviously, I'd love to see more of it. I'd like to talk more of it, of course, on this podcast. But one of the things I've always wanted to do, especially after spending years and years of reading about Mongols in the history books, I've always wanted to take a step into actual Mongolia and experience the people down there. I've heard a lot of good things about Mongolian hospitality, of course, Mongolian cuisine, and I certainly would love to be right around there and perhaps engage in a conversation with you in person in the future.
Yeah, you are welcome here anytime.
That really warms my heart. And And it makes me really think I should.
I also want to add something.
Oh, yeah, go on.
Yeah. Also, I forgot to mention the effect of the climate change in our country, in our nomadic lifestyle, because of the climate change and also the environmental issues. More and more nomadic people are abandoning their lifestyle and heading to the city. This is actually one of the biggest concern for me because of the desertification and also the other environmental issues. uh, More people are abandoning their lifestyle and heading to the city. So I just wanted to mention this issue. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that can often be in many ways quite disconcerting because obviously it means that the nomadic lifestyle is becoming in some ways a little bit less viable, and not necessarily because it in some ways has somehow failed on its own merits, but because in many ways the world has acted upon it. And I think obviously the world can act in many good ways. Obviously, it, if the world hadn't acted upon it to bring us all these vibrant technologies, maybe we wouldn't be talking today. But also, in many ways, I can see that there are difficulties with seeing how sometimes like the nomadic herders are unable to sustain like the way they have been living for centuries, and this is through no fault of their own. And I think that's something that I would definitely like to get people to understand on a more fundamental level.
Mm. Okay. So is there another question?
I do believe I have one. Yeah, actually, it is no, unfortunately our last question, and I don't know how much time I have left. Anyways, since our world is moving very quickly, and obviously I have elderly grandparents that help take care of in some ways, uh, but before I send you on your merry way, I think I have to ask a very important question to for you. Where can people find your work, and how can they also support it?
Yeah. My YouTube channel is called Real Mongolia. So you can search my channel and subscribe. That would be very helpful. And so right now I don't have that much followers, but I have a plan to like interview people, Mongol people, and also I planning to conduct interview in the streets of Ulaanbaatar so that I can uh, give the normal everyday people opinion to the public. And yeah, I have a lot of plans to produce content. So I think actually this lockdown will be helpful because so I can stay in my home and focus on my contents. So I have a lot of contents coming up. So if you would subscribe, that would be very nice.
Well, I'll certainly encourage everybody to go onto Bayara's channel and give them their subscription. I'll also be including Bayara's channel link in the show notes. And also, I've been thinking about this a little bit. I do still have some pretty good contact with Jack Meister. He actually has his own YouTube channel, and that's how I've been interacting with him, and how he's been able to enlighten me on so much of Mongolian history. And one of my big thinkings that ever since I came into contact with you is that I have to get you and Jack Meister to talk and interact, because I think that would be a great way for both of you to learn about the history of Mongolia.
Yeah, because I'm kind of a history nerd, so I think we can a lot of to talk about.
I'll definitely have to DM you his email as soon as I'm finished with this. So,
Okay, so um, so do we have another I have nothing to do this evening, so we can talk about other topics if you want.
Um, I didn't have anything really come to mind at this point, and unfortunately, my schedule is going to be a little bit more booked a little later on. But obviously, I will make sure that if I have any free time in the future to talk to you, I will make that time because you are the first Mongol that I have found and brought to my show, and so I hope to bring you as often as I can. And
Yeah. Also, yeah, Hungary is also one of my favorite countries, so I want to visit one day.
oh yeah, it's a very good country to visit, although the situation has gotten a bit more complicated since the pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah, so you are welcome here anytime.
Yep, and I can assure you that you will be very welcome with me in America or in Hungary.
Yeah, all right. So, Bayerste means goodbye.
Bayerstamm, and hope we all have some sort of wellness in this COVID-19 pandemic, as Blue Heaven wills it.
Yeah, I hope everyone will be safe and good luck with everything with your life.
All right. And if you like this segment of the Mongols podcast, be sure to check me out on Substack, TikTok, or YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. You can also follow me on Tumblr and check out my podcast where all podcasts are found, and support me on Patreon and PayPal. After all that, just have a good day and be safe, as Blue Heaven wills it. There we go, and that is Bayara, the great Mongolian journalist.